Running Light Ministry podcast is brought to you by listeners like you. You can support these podcasts by making a gift to the ministries at runninglight.org.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the Running Light podcast, October 27, 2022, episode 139. I'm your host, Bo, and I'm here with Peter Martin, and we got a good show for you today. And this is, I don't know what to name this one, but it might be just the insanity of sex.
Sex and politics?
Sex and politics, and maybe I should add this to the book that I'm kind of finishing writing.
Might fit in there.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Because I have a sex and politics section.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, but this one might be good just on the madness of it all. You know, so we're gonna Peter's gonna kind of throw out some good articles, and we're gonna kind of talk about it, and then kind of go from there.
So at the time of our recording this podcast, we're up against the midterm elections in the U.S. of A.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had some colorful candidates come to the surface, and I use that in more than one meaning of the word. Yeah. So the first is a guy out of New York. His name is Mike Itkis. He's a Ukrainian national, came over here. And in order to promote his candidacy for, again, being a member of the House of Representatives, he released a sex tape, of which I will not tell you the title of. But essentially, it's a 13-minute sex tape in which he hired a porn star to have sex on film, and he put it on many different porn sites. Now, this is a quote from him about why he did it, like why he thinks this is such a positive move for his candidacy. He says, "Our laws still emphasize marriage as the most appropriate context for sexual activity, and a lot of laws on the books, such as those prohibiting adultery and sex work, are simply wrong for a society where half of the adult population isn't married. The political thrust of Itkis's message is underscored by the talking points posted with the video, which include sex between two people who aren't married or still in a long-term relationship," which is like the lamest keywords underneath a porn video I've ever read. It's like sex between two people who aren't married or involved in a long-term relationship. And it says, he says about this, is still very valuable to individuals involved. And restrictions on sexual behavior based on marital status are outdated and harmful. So that's Mike Itkis down in New York City, but in Pennsylvania.
So that's New York City?
That's New York City. In Pennsylvania, a budding politician by the name of Alexandra Hunt, who's a former stripper, who now has developed an OnlyFans page and following, and now is also running for Congress. So you have Mike Itkis, who is a congressman who made a porn video, and now you have someone coming out of the stripping industry into OnlyFans, which is a type of pornography. And you and I have talked about OnlyFans before and how it is, in a lot of ways, the future of the sex industry in our country, unfortunately. But she's also running for Congress on a very similar platform. And actually, OnlyFans, I believe, is sponsoring her. So this is a tweet that she put out earlier this month. "Young men aren't having sex. Nearly a third of men under 30 have not had sex, and a much higher percent do not have as much sex as they would like. Not exactly surprising, but this kind of statistic is a sign of much deeper problems. Our society criminalizes sex and sweeps it under the rug. The consequences are straightforward. There is more violence. Since platforms like Craigslist were banned from advertising sex, serious violent crimes against women, all women, not just sex workers, has increased by nearly 1/5. We should be moving toward a right to sex. People should be able to have sex when they feel they want to, and we need to develop services that meet people's needs without attaching the baggage of shame or criminalization."
This is just amazing, man. These are the. What's your thoughts on this, Peter?
So it's interesting, and you and I have kind of talked about this, and I do think it's interesting that you have a chapter in your new book called Sex and Politics.
Yeah, I do.
So I think what you and I were talking about last week when I first texted this to you, because I just thought it was funny, and it is one of those instances where you gotta laugh or cry about the current political situation in our country.
That's right.
And I've chosen to laugh. It used to be material like this was the thing that like the mafia would would hold over your head and say, you better vote the way we want or all these are going to be released to the public. Now we have people who not only are coming into the office, into this election season with this type of material available, but they're making more as a way to promote their campaign, which should show you a little bit about where our culture is kind of going and what we see. And what you and I always talk about is that since Christianity is true, there actually isn't a such thing as progression beyond Christianity. All there is regression. So what we're actually seeing is we're seeing a rehashing of the kind of politics that the world theater has known since the dawn of man. I mean, you look at Roman society and the kind of Roman politicians that were really prominent. Think of guys like Caligula and people like that who were just super open and blatant about their sexual promiscuity. You even have in the Bible, you have a depiction of a strip show that's going on in front of Herod and his political compatriots. And by the way, it's not only a strip show, but it's a strip show put on by his daughter, kind of, his stepdaughter, and she's depicted as being a minor. So we have these sexual perversions that are happening in that culture that today we're seeing coming back, right? This kind of political theater that was happening in the United States where politicians were ashamed of this behavior and they were trying to pretend like it wasn't happening. Now it's just on full display, and now it's becoming a platform to run, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and it almost feels a little Romans chapter 1 of the Bible where it talks about, that they continue to approve of people that practice evil. It's like a full-blown approval of it, But, what we find really, I think, fascinating about it is you have, like, all these, like, we live in a society that most people would say is very civil.
Right.
Is like a civil society.
Yeah.
Most people would say our society is better off today than it's been in the past, like as in, thousands of years ago, that science has brought us to this amazing, wonderful place of wonderful quality of life. And you have in our country, you have a very, popular movement called the progressive movement that has gone on for years, and people would say is now in places of power, very strong, powerful positions politically, and even in our has dominated our educational system for years, and so it's kind of interesting because you have this progression, you have this great scientific world, you have this great, and then you have, writers, on the flip side of what these two politicians kind of are going their direction.
Right. So remember, let me just remind of what their argument is. Their argument is that legalizing sex work and creating a right to sex would be positive for our society, and the female in this, Alexander Hunt, actually argues that it will be empowering to women and it will benefit them long term.
Yeah. And what's interesting is then you have people like, we've quoted Robert Jensen many times in our podcast, is he's one of those guys where you always want to kind of follow him just to get a good idea of his thoughts and kind of that section of life. He kind of represents a feministic, anti-porn perspective, a very strong one, and then he puts out this article on October 19th to the followers of his blog called "Feminism and Prostitution Beyond the Happy Hooker," and And his article is really about the sexual exploitiveness of the patriarchal system against women, and which puts women in positions to sell their bodies for money. Even though they think it's liberalism and they think it's, libertarian to do so, they really are under this oppressive patriarchal system. And he kind of goes about it with these questions. He's like, is it possible to imagine any society achieving a meaningful level of justice if people from one gender class are routinely bought and sold for sexual services by people from another sex gender class? So that's his first question, which is really interesting because these people that you just quoted in their article in the present day would say, yeah. Their answer would be like, can you achieve a meaningful level of justice if people, he says, are buying one another?
And they would say, yeah.
They would say, sure.
Yeah. So the argument from the other side is mutual usury is mutually objectifying, and so it kind of cancels it out. So it's like, yeah, the guy buying the woman for a night of sex, he is using her body to get what he wants, but she's also using him to get what she wants. And so therefore it kind of cancels it out. And I can't remember who said this, but I thought it was a pretty insightful statement. He said, in order to fight the patriarchy, what some feminists have chosen to do is take the worst aspects of malehood, and they've then adopted it as being femininity. So they're taking the worst possible attributes of masculinity, and they're like, that's ours. You don't get to be a pig. We get to be pigs, and that's the empowering thing. And Robert Jensen's perspective, which is funny, because his argument is essentially like, I know you want to do that, but you shouldn't.
Right.
Which is more like our argument, which is very fascinating that someone who is so into feminism, but his argumentation is going to be more of, well, this stuff is bad because the patriarchy created it, and therefore it's bad. Where we're suggesting that maybe it's bad because it's bad. Maybe it's like maybe there's an objective metric of what's right and wrong when it comes to our sexuality, what will bring greater prosperity and happiness, and what will bring about pleasure, short-term pleasure, but long-term amounts of emptiness, right?
Yeah. So Robert states another question. He says, okay, if we lived in an egalitarian society with sex gender justice, would the idea of buying and selling people for sexual services likely emerge at all?
That's one where I would say that's a pretty easy answer, and the answer is yes.
Yeah, and he's thinking somehow, you could tell, and the way he's writing the question is the answer is no.
Right.
Like he's thinking that, oh no, if we live in an egalitarian society,
right, which is where everybody's equal, like men and women totally treated equal, there's no distinctions.
Right. That he thinks that, hey, if we have this kind of sex gender justice, the idea of buying and selling people for sexual services would never emerge.
Right.
Like, which is an amazing statement.
Right.
Right. Like never emerge. It would never enter someone's mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a reason why it's called the oldest profession.
Right.
You didn't need a patriarchal system to develop the idea that, and by the way, the reason why it's called the oldest profession is because you need something to sell to somebody, and what's the first thing people had before we could accumulate any type of goods or services? Well, the first thing you could sell is yourself, right? So that's the oldest profession. It's not some patriarchal system that developed this as a means of people making money. It was people wanting to make money through this simple service that they're providing. In other words, they saw in themselves an ability to market their own sexuality for monetary purposes. And that's why you see that, our society is becoming more and more egalitarian. We are seeing the distinctions between men and women fade away, and yet people selling themselves has increased, not decreased.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So if things are becoming more equal,
right,
and you have this huge political movement of women's equality,
right,
in our culture and everything, everything equal, then you would think that this would and not enter our minds anymore. But no, right? No, obviously the patriarchal system, the empire of patriarchy continues to move. But you were in reading one of the articles, you saw something underneath one of these articles. And these articles, one of them is written very much in the Robert Jensen format, that it's very anti-pornography, pro-feminism. So it's pro-feminism, anti-pornography, prostitution, sexual exploitation.
Yeah.
And so that's how this article is written that you're reading.
Right.
And then right underneath it.
Right underneath. So let me read a quote from the article just so you can see the similarities between Robert Jensen and this article. A feminist society is one in which men are not assured sex with women or paternity on demand. Yet so many people who think they're feminists try to circumvent this with, if we were less ashamed of sex / rigid about relationships, enough women would happily meet everyone's needs. So again, very Robert Jensen in that perspective.
Yeah.
But then underneath the article, so you scroll down, and then I saw underneath the article just today, it says Glamour Brazil awards male influencer Woman of the Year.
Which is phenomenal.
Just the fact that there's no pretext to that's just listed as the title, as if you should just know that it's not a joke. That there's no irony or satire present when a glamour company in Brazil names a man Woman of the Year. That's just the way it is.
Which is so odd. And for those that are trying to catch on to why we find this odd, is you have an article that is absolutely saying women, we need to uphold them, respect them, treat them equal, everything. We have to give them their props. And then the next article just below it is a man wins Woman of the Year. Meaning you're so against the patriarchy and the systems of patriarchy over the thousands of years that have oppressed women and put women down, but yet you have a society that's saying women are equal, and yet they can't see something so odd about a man winning glamour of the year, glamour model of the year in Brazil. It's like, men, isn't that patriarchy? Isn't that a part of the system? I mean, that puts a man to win a woman, and a woman's position.
Me and my wife were talking about this week, because this I just read today, but last week, it was either last week or the week before, Ulta started their own podcast, and on the podcast they had as a representative for womanhood and girlhood 2 men. Right, so you had 2 men who were, one was non-binary, the other identified as a woman, talking about being a woman and talking about being girls. And she was so appalled. Like, when I showed my wife that, she was so offended. Like, she didn't think it was funny. I thought it was pretty funny.
Yeah.
She was just offended, and she was like, "Why does this never happen the other way around?"
Right.
And I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Well, you never see Men of the Year be a woman, you never see a female actually take Man of the Year, or just have a GQ podcast where they're talking about masculinity or manhood and have 2 women talking about it. You would never see it flipped. Why is it only happening to us?" And I was like, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
But the obvious answer for me is, maybe the feminists are not as against the patriarchy as they think,
Right.
Maybe by blurring the line between male and female, there's actually not a suppression of the patriarchy, but maybe it moves into another focus. And what I said there is, because of the way that God created men and women, the only way that men are not going to dominate women is if we are put underneath a system that teaches us to use our strength to protect and to provide, as opposed to exploit. If you remove that system and you say men and women are essentially equal, then men will do what men have always done, and that is use their strength not to protect and provide, but to exploit. And there's no other way to go around that. And so the people could say, well, we're fighting for equality. Men and women are totally the same. Well, they don't look the same. When you have men dominating women at all these various things, you have to ask the question, well, you have our Attorney General is a man, and he was nominated for Woman of the Year. Bruce Jenner is a man, and he was nominated for Woman of the Year. You have the best female swimmer, Leah Thomas, is a man. So you go down the list, and you're like, women are just being shoved out of all their accomplishments. And I even read this other article where they're not even allowing for the normal feminist, I guess you call them icons, to be women anymore. So I read an article that was arguing that Joan of Arc was not actually a woman, that if she was living in today's society, she would be at least non-binary, but maybe trans. And, Susan B. Anthony, right? All these, Mary Louise Walcott, they're arguing that all these people that feminists are like, these are the best. Now they're like, no, they weren't even women.
Yeah, it's so sad.
It's really sad.
They have taken a women right away. And it's so weird, right, that women would play right into the hands of male domination.
Right.
So openly.
Right.
So much that they would literally, they want women to be men.
Right.
And they're ticked off that the word woman is used of Joan of Arc.
Right.
She's not a woman.
Yeah.
It's like, what? But it's just odd. It's so weird, right? Now, Robert Jensen, and from his anti-porn perspective, sees these politicians probably as part of this horrible system.
Right.
But what we see is he's using terms like justice, right living, the right thing to do kind of thing. But he really never gets to why it's the right thing.
Right.
Why it matters. The right kind of system is a system that is egalitarian and
right.
and it's it's a just system, and a just system is the right kind of thing, right kind of living. But again, what is his basis for these points that he's making?
Right.
It's just the right thing to do. Well, let me flip this in a little bit. We've gotten here to this point, to where we're at today.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And where he's able to make his points, and he's able to write books,
yeah,
and he's able to do these things, and it's all been under, quote, the patriarchy.
Yeah.
Right? And what's interesting is these politicians are able to actually have sex videos,
yeah,
and do whatever they want, and that's, quote, under the patriarchy.
Right.
And it kind of makes you wonder, what exactly does the patriarchy provide? Since it's so vast.
Yeah.
If the patriarchy system is the system that we're in, that's the box that we're in.
Right.
And that system has within it,
yeah,
everything that is on so many different sides. It has people that consider having sex on video totally wrong and injustice and sexually exploitive, and prostitution is an absolute work of sexual exploitation, and it's all that's part of the box of patriarchy. And then the patriarchy box also has people that love sex,
yeah,
and love to put themselves on video and
yeah,
thinks that they should do it for free. Don't we see a problem here that if that either this, either patriarchy is not what you think,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
and your definition of it is wrong,
right,
or there's something else other than the patriarchy,
right,
that's going on,
right,
because Robert Jensen's version of patriarchy is it's all this, it's all this, it's all that, but it's not all that.
Right.
There's places around the world where people don't realize it's we don't want to do that.
Right.
And not everybody prostitutes themselves.
Right.
And not everybody's filming themselves.
Right.
The percentage of people that prostitute in the United States, or the amount of people that do a sex video and put it up on a site has to be pretty low.
Right.
Percentage wise.
Right.
Right.
And the funny thing is without knowing it, the article that I was reading actually undermines its own point, and it proves something that you've said previously, because they're like Robert Jensen, they blame pornography, but what they unintentionally divulge is the fact that, like she said, men are having less sex. So actually, porn has caused try to follow my calculus here. So porn, the proliferation of pornography has caused men to have less sex. Therefore, less men are being sexually exploitive and abusive towards women physically. So why isn't that a net good? Right? So if Robert Jensen's whole argument is men shouldn't be able to exploit or to use women, but your mentality about the patriarchy is that men are just like these horrible people that are always going
watching
to seek
porn,
exploitation.
and porn is exploitive and racist and all that.
So it's like, from your perspective, what would you rather? Would you rather men be having a lot of sex, in which case not only is their sexual behavior affecting them, but it's affecting their partner? Or would you rather them be utilizing material that's put forth willingly, that they can do at the privacy of their home, and then they pay that person for it, and so they're not actually exploiting anyone physically, just mentally? So from like, what's so bad about that? And again, the article tries very hard to say, like, well, no, men who are on porn, they're more likely to abuse women sexually. Well, it's like, well, you just said that they're actually less likely to have sex. You just said they're not having sex. So actually, they're less likely to do something abusive or exploitive to women.
Well, they're still abusing them, though, Peter, because they're paying that chat woman girl, and that's exploitive.
Right.
That's part of the patriarchy.
Right.
And you almost wonder, like, with Professor Jensen, you almost wonder, like, you almost want to say, Robert, why don't you just invoke God here?
Yeah, I know.
You know what I mean?
He's so close. You know he wants
invoke
to.
God. Why don't you just say the big word? Why don't you just say God?
Yeah.
because really, it's like, it sounds like you want people to be, in a very consensual, monogamous, pure, kind of relationship that's based on attributes like love, compassion, meaning,
right?
Longevity,
right?
It sounds like that's what he wants,
right?
In people, and that the world will this will happen,
right?
If we just somehow deconstruct, patriarchy,
right?
That this is going to take place.
Yeah.
And yet, obviously, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Again, like I say, the box is, patriarchy. If you say it's the patriarchy, well, then that's the box we're in, patriarchal box.
Right.
And that box has created a lot of interesting things.
Right.
We have women that love buying men.
Yeah.
And they love dominating men.
Right.
And
which I wonder what his thoughts on that would be. Like, is he opposed to male prostitution, which is not as low a percentage as people think.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're talking about prostitution and sex work, some people think that it's just almost 100% women being bought by men, but that's actually not true. I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it's a quarter, right?
Yeah. I mean, he puts his cards on the table for. He talks about men and women being prostitutes, and again. That there's an economic system that has created the person who needs to sell their body.
Right. So I mean the clear thing that he's actually against. So when he uses the word patriarchy, and this is unfortunate with a lot of modern progressive thinkers, is what they're actually attacking is the institutions, right? So they're just looking at our cultural institutions. They're saying they're bad, and it's more of like a Marxist idea, right? So, capitalism has created this bad thing. Capitalism is created by men, and therefore this is going to happen in this particular way. But I mean, if you think about the logic of it, you'd be like, okay, so patriarchal means that it's male ruled. So in your mindset, men have created a system in which men need to prostitute themselves. So men really didn't think it through very much, did they? Right? So I mean, if we've created a system in which we have to prostitute ourselves in order to make a living, then clearly we didn't think this whole male dominance thing out too well.
Yeah.
And male prostitution, it's not like this is a novel thing. Once again, you go into Greco-Roman societies, male prostitutes were just as common as female prostitutes. And their utilization in sexual practices by both men and women were widely practiced, right? And you can go to other cultures and you see the same thing. Especially, by the way, there was usually classes of men that were castrated, unit classes of men that were used exclusively as sex slaves. So you could look at that and you could say, well, this is all patriarchal. Well, that doesn't make any sense, though, because patriarchal would insinuate that you're now dividing up mankind between male and female, and it's the men dominating the women. But what instead you're showing like you're talking about a multifaceted approach to man's nature. That maybe it's not split mankind down the middle and it's men oppressing women. Maybe it's mankind oppressing and exalting themselves in various ways, right? In some ways we could be generous and gentle, and in other ways we could be oppressive. And maybe it's not one gender over another. Maybe it's just man's mad dash to oppress himself.
Yeah, and like I wonder if Mr. Jensen ever got to the place where he thought, like, maybe my writing is a product of the patriarchy.
Right.
Like maybe
you, a white man,
a white male man,
are telling women not to make money on OnlyFans.
Right. Like maybe I'm under the influence of patriarchy, and maybe, if patriarchy is as dominating as they say it is,
right,
then it's entrenched.
Right.
Then it is, you can't get out of it.
Right.
It is something that will be, the way we would have to get out of it would be like absolute annihilation or DNA, like some kind of, chemical way to change the way humans are.
Right.
I guess that's my point, is like, because it's, you don't just take thousands of years of patriarchy and just because you write an article that says, hey, this is all because of patriarchal systems,
right,
that we're going to change the patriarchy.
Right.
No, what you're part of it.
Right. And you could even ask, like, well, where did you get that ethic from?
Yeah.
That people shouldn't sell themselves.
Right.
And I'm reading a book right now called Dominion by a historian named Tom Holland. It's really, really good. He's not a Christian, but he started research for the book because he thought that Christianity was terrible and it's led to all these patriarchal systems of destruction. And he started studying church history, and he realized what came before Christianity and what Christianity pushed out. And he essentially, the conclusion he came to is, I don't agree with the premise of Christianity, but I like what it's done. I like the fact that I now find prostitution to be morally apprehensible, something that was never questioned in any society prior to Christendom, prior to the rise of Christendom. The idea that men shouldn't sell other men, whether we're talking about sex slaves or slavery in general, the idea that people should not be property of another, that is a novel Christian idea that is only based on a philosophy that states that men are inherently valuable because of our creation in the image and likeness of God, right? That belief
and women
system,
are part of that.
And women are part of that imago Dei, that image-bearing ministry to the creation, right? A very unique and important part of it, right? That's the only thing that elevates men and women to a place where we feel as though we should not exploit one another. Otherwise, once again, what's wrong with somebody of their free will and volition selling themselves for money, if that's what they want to do?
Yeah, and he puts another question. He says, my last question, he says, you're speaking with a girl who is considering future vocations. You want her to live in a world with sex, gender, justice. And this is the big word,
justice.
Sex, gender, justice.
That's right. Social justice, gender justice, trans justice, civil justice.
Right.
All justice, man.
She asks you, what do you think I should be when I grow up? And do you include prostitute in the list? If she includes that on the list, do you respond in the same way as to other possibilities? So,
which is, again, like, it's a weird question, because it's like, if I asked anyone, what would you want to be when you grow up, and they responded and said a sewage worker, right? What would you think if your kid said that to you? Would you say, well, right on, sewage
trash
worker?
Collector.
Yeah, trash collector, bricklayer. Would you honestly look at them and say, well, right on, that's a noble profession. A lot of people, someone's got to do it, and that's a part of our society.
Yeah.
Go for it. Or would you be offended? So in other words, what he's saying is, the fact that I wouldn't want my kid or a woman that I'm with to list that as a potential vocation would insinuate that it's not a valid one.
Yeah, well, and the problem I have with this too is it's super subjective.
Right.
I mean, right? And that's what you're getting at.
Right.
It's like, what if, like, me coming from a progressive background, if my kid says to me, or for instance, this is an anecdotal thing,
right.
but I'll share it. If I went to my dad and said, "Hey, Dad, I want to join the military,"
yeah,
my dad would have kicked me out of the house and said, "You have to live someplace else."
Right.
My kid is not going to join the military under my roof.
Right.
He is not going to join the military establishment and industry in this country that exploits its military action worldwide.
Right.
That's true from a true progressive, by the way, right? from a pretty Noam Chomsky.
Not the modern progressive who's all for the war in Ukraine.
That's right. That's a for war. That's right. This is the total guy who's like, no,
Yeah.
And thing is to my dad, that would be wrong.
Right.
And it would be like if someone said to me today, like, hey, when I hear someone say, oh, well, I'm in nursing school. Right. A part of me cringes.
Right.
Now, the reason why is because my dad taught me that the healthcare system in our country is in cahoots with giant money. Right. And we've learned to call that big pharma.
There's no evidence of that, Bo.
There's none.
There's no evidence that big pharma has anything to do with the medical industry.
That's why
today.
This podcast is brought to you by Pfizer.
That's right.
That's right. But in all, hey, when someone becomes a nurse, are they not joining the exploitiveness of that mob-run industry that is charging thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for 15-minute scans on people in the ER that need to know what's going on with their bodies? I mean, doesn't everybody find that just a crazy bit exploitive?
Yeah.
Taking people who in their weakest moments in life and charging them ungodly amounts where they have to sell a car or sell a home in order to pay for health care.
Right.
That sounds very exploitive.
Right.
It sounds like a system that is set up. They want you to be sick.
Right.
Hence FDA.
Right.
And so that so this thing can grow. Right. So money can be made. Like, why doesn't Robert Jensen say, hey, you know what? If the girl says, hey, I want to be a nurse, why doesn't he say that's horrible?
Yeah.
That's a part of an exploitive system.
Right.
See, if it's all part of the patriarchy,
it's all a part of a exploitive system.
It's all part of the patriarchy. And this is what he can't seem to get away from.
Right.
If he's saying it's all patriarchal and the patriarchal systems, and he's so elusive, right, on the systems that are in place, well, then it's all a part of it, man.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the young girl says.
Right.
It is part of the exploitive system.
Right.
And so it's wrong. So his argument's wrong.
Right.
And so I see that logically he's not being very
And that's the problem that you brought up earlier, where you said, like, why doesn't he just invoke God? You know, like, it's just like, at that point, it's because if you don't have an objective reality to appeal to, then all you have left is subjective reality. So he has to ask questions like that. Wouldn't you want it this way? Instead of saying, it doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter if you're a super progressive person who you start dating someone and they say, I want to be a prostitute. And you're like, that's awesome. How forward thinking of you. You know, you're not going to be under a pimp like the old patriarchal days. You're going to be the pimp. You know, you're going to be the person who's not only creating their own content, but you're running other people. Maybe you're going to be in the sex industry and you're going to run a stable of men. You know, maybe you're like way progressive in that direction. You know, it doesn't, like, from our perspective, it doesn't matter someone's subjective response to it. It only matters, is it right? So for both this person, these people that are running for Congress, as well as Robert Jensen, we would say, the reason why it's wrong is not because we feel it's wrong. The reason why it's wrong is because there's a purpose for sex, there's a purpose for human being, and those purposes run contradictory towards the sex industry. That's why they're wrong.
Yeah.
It's not just that they're part of a patriarchal system.
Right. And then the big political question is, how many laws do you want to put in place when it comes to our sexuality?
Right.
You know, what kind of society do we want to live in? And when you ask that and you say, well, I want to live in a good society where everybody does exactly what I think they should do. Well, how are you going to implement that?
Right.
You know, how do you force that?
Right.
You know, how do you, criminalize activity that's not on your side, not what you want?
Right.
You know, isn't he doing the very thing that the patriarchy system has done to say, or the puritanical patriarchy, you know, the Christian patriarchy has done to criminalize homosexuality?
Yeah.
So isn't he asking for a system, a political system that uses some form of legislation to get rid of certain sexual things?
Right.
You know, isn't that exactly what, quote, Christian patriarchy has done, the puritanical people?
Yeah.
You know, haven't they used their political power to say no to certain sexual things?
Yeah.
So it's like he's doing the same exact thing.
Right.
He's just not using the word Christian.
Right.
But it seems to me like he's right there.
Yeah, it was funny. I was this morning I was listening to a debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault back in 1971, and it's cool to see him go back and forth. But when you see him go back and forth, you realize, like, oh, this is why progressivism failed. You know, because like they have these lofty ideals, but then when they start talking about what it would take to implement them, you're like, oh, you're wanting the same type of power systems that you've just condemned.
Right.
You're not saying, like, because in the beginning of the conversation, they were both coming out super, like, libertarian. The power systems that are in authority right now are bad. They're ruining people. They're oppressing the social classes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But then they start talking about building better ones, and you recognize, like, oh, you're not against the power systems. You're against the people that are in charge. And that's a very different thing.
The current people. That's right.
But, like, you could tell in the audience, and you could look at the audience, and it's not young, hippie people. It's like suit and tie, Berkeley, probably, you know, college-educated, white, liberal, high-class progressives. That's who is in the audience, and that's exactly what's happened to the progressive movement. So you start out in the progressive movement of power itself is bad. We should have a more equal system in which there's less governmental control and there's less corporate control, and it's progressed into, no, actually, these control systems are not what's wrong. What's wrong is who's controlling them. And now that we have the control, now they're good, right? Now that we own them, now they're good. And that's why you see kind of Robert Jensen's argument caving in on itself a little bit.
Oh, a lot.
Because it's like, it's not actually a progressive argument. Just say what you want to say, man. Like to say, I have an objective view of how I think things ought to be, and I'm willing to use systems of power to implement my vision upon the world.
Yeah. And this is interesting, because it seems like human beings, if they are not given the opportunity to prostitute themselves, then then they are tyrannically run by a power group so that they do not prostitute themselves. It doesn't seem like humans flourish in that tyrannical system. So when you look at a system of puritanical government that is saying we're against prostitution, we're against these exploitive sexual exploitation things, sex trafficking, things of this nature, where it's all banned, we're not going to do it. We would think that kind of system in history would like produce incredible flourishing.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to produce flourishing.
All you got to do is go to Islamic nations.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
And ask how liberated are the women underneath a system like that? How liberated are the men under a system like that? And lust always finds a way, man, because what they do over there is you can marry someone for an hour.
Right.
Right? So, like, what do you think is happening during that hour that they're married?
Insane.
So there's always a way that you could religify it all you want, but that's not actually going to work. So what most Christian cultures have done throughout the ages, which I think is the best solution you can come to, is you create a cultural and societal standard. This is wrong. And then you create laws that can regulate it, but then restricting it is a bridge too far.
Yeah.
Right. And you've heard even great Christian theologians throughout the ages like Augustine and Aquinas, who are much against prostitution, say, yes, however, without the intrinsic change in the heart of man, implementing this ideology will be fruitless. Right? You're not going to get anywhere. And that's what, again, our nation learned during Prohibition, during the 20s. You can create a standard. You could create a societal standard and say, this is not right. We're opposed to it. But once you start with a strong arm implementing that in a teetotal fashion of prohibition, you're going to cause more problems than you solve.
Right. Hence prohibition.
Exactly.
Right. And the Christian way is one where it's a law in the heart.
Right.
And this is something that educators have lost out on. And I think this is what's developed our problems recently, maybe in the country.
Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that real quick. I know we're probably running out of time, but C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, he argued that a highly intellectual society is actually not going to be less hedonistic.
Right.
So, and his argument was essentially this, like, you have the mind, you have the heart, which resides the passions and the desires of a person, and then you have the appetites, the base appetites, which would be essentially sex, power, and money. And he says, like, the main thing that actually runs a man, that encourages a man towards true virtue, and this is what you're talking about for the Christian, is not, I intellectually understand that this is a wrong thing to do. It's instead, I have a passion and desire to do something different, right? I have a passion and desire to honor God, to honor my marriage vows, to honor my family and community. Like, I have these things that I understand I ought to do that I'm not just pulling out of abstract philosophical thought. These are prerogatives that are given to me through Scripture, through my community, and I'm choosing to adhere to them, right? That's what actually changes a person. And Lewis argued, because the luminaries that he was around, and I use that word facetiously, were saying, well, Lewis, once we get all these crazy Christian fundamentals out of the way and we just create a society built around science and reason, everyone's going to be totally self-controlled. And, Huxley also hits on this in A Brave New World. But his theory was, no, if you take away someone's desire or aspiration for better, if you remove that and you just reduce someone down to just intellectual philosophizing, their base appetites will run rampant. And now we have a society that's highly educated, and yet we got a lot
just as criminal.
We got a lot of crazy desires running around.
Yeah, and if Robert, I think, wanted to really, hit people in the right way, it's the idea of invoking the deity. It's invoking that, hey, what you have to get back to why we were created.
Right.
What is our purpose?
Right.
And when people students are in college,
right.
and they're no longer thinking about their accountability with a creator.
Right.
They're basically, that's lost.
Right.
Then really anything goes at that point. The Christian is always thinking, hey, how is this affecting that person?
Right.
The greatest commandments of loving God, loving your neighbor as yourself, doing good to others, thinking through those things, is something that's always on our heart. And that's what answers the question of, like, should I prostitute myself?
Right.
It's like, well, how can I honor God? How can I glorify God?
Right.
What has God given me in my like you're talking about? What has God created my sexuality for?
Right.
These kind of things. And you have to, either hearts change on their own through some form of a relational way,
right,
or you have to coerce and force people,
right,
through a political system,
right,
through a legislative system,
right,
and you either force people to do it, and you make them, put on the mask, and you say, it's illegal now. If you don't have a mask, you're going to jail.
Yeah.
Or you help people go, hey, we think this is the most loving thing to do with the science that we have out.
Right.
And we would hope that you guys would look at this science and go, hey, ask the question, what is the most loving thing to do? And some people do try that tactic,
right,
and they try to go that route. But then other people will say, nope, we got to force it.
Yeah.
It's such a big issue, we got to force.
Yeah.
Which
is and again, that's the whole point where, Apostle Paul, when he talks about the law of the Lord being liberty, what he means is that the intent of the law, and the ultimate intent of the law, is to actually free man, is to make us free. And what he means by that is, if God would have kept the old covenant, the reason why the old covenant, Paul describes it as slavery, is because the old covenant functioned off of a system in which if you didn't do it, you were punished, you were penalized. Paul says that system can't actually make you free. And the reason why is because you're restricted by the strictures around you. That's it. That's what's happening to you. But you're not choosing it. And because you're not choosing it, you're not free. Paul's argument is that, no, like, the law of the Lord is liberty. Why? Because if I willingly subjectify myself to it, I become more free. Right? But if someone makes it restrictive upon me, I'm less free because I'm not understanding what I'm doing. And so even in our politics, for Christians, we're always trying to figure it out. How do we orient the political systems around us to maximize liberty? Sometimes it's counterintuitive, and that requires restriction, right? There's, if we just said, hey, anyone could rob whatever they want, then you got San Francisco, right? and it's not that great anymore. So there has to be some amount of restriction, but if you go too far, then you actually negate liberty. And if you negate liberty, you also negate any type of virtue. And you haven't made people better, you've made them worse.
Interesting, right?
Yeah.
This would be like human beings, though, from a Bible perspective, a biblical perspective, is that, there's a way that seems right to humans, but in the end it leads to destruction.
Right.
Right? And, whether you're on the two political Mr. Eckel, I think it was, or what was his name?
Ickes,
Mr. Ickes and the lady.
Yeah.
Or you're on Robert Jensen's side. There's a way that seems right.
Yeah.
But in the end, unless the heart of human beings is changed, not through other human beings in putting their will upon someone, but through a real work of God,
right?
A real work of the deity. It seems like we are just lost. It's always going to end up in, no matter what side you choose,
right?
You're going to go the wrong way. And it's interesting. We have in the Bible prostitutes,
right?
And we have people that ended up turning out to be amazing people,
right?
Though they were at some point part of this incredibly horrible system, but you don't see the Bible just putting up this this incredible law, and this incredible legislative idea around it. Like, for instance, I guess my point is this, is even though there's the law, there's this, what Robert Jensen would want is kind of this system that has a strong law against things. You see in the Bible a tremendous amount of liberty,
right,
to break those laws,
right,
and a tremendous amount of mercy,
right,
within the framework,
right,
which
is again the irony, because the word liberal comes from the word liberty.
Yeah.
It's the word freedom. And it is funny that the Progressive Liberal Party has now changed their tune so much.
Yeah. Very interesting. Anyway, hey, great podcast. And Sex and Politics. Check it out. So take care. Bye-bye.
Check out runninglight.org to begin our 2 video series, Take Flight and Love or Lust. You can also send us questions on Twitter at Running Light or on our runninglight.org podcast page. Like us on Facebook at Running Light Ministries. Psalm 36:8. They are abundantly satisfied with the fullness of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your pleasures.